Greetings and welcome. Today we're going to be painting this right here. It's titled Light in the Sky. It was based off this painting right here. It's quite large, and because of that, I've had it unfinished for a number of years actually, and I wanted to figure out what I wanted to do with it, and I find the easiest way of going about that is just doing a lot of small studies. So that's how I created this one. That's kind of why I created this one, but I ended up really loving the piece, and I thought that it made a great lesson for painting light in beams and rays and clouds. Anyways, as I say in every video, if you need help with the drawing process, you can find a digital sketch up over on Patreon. You can use it to print out, you can use the grid lines to transfer to canvas. I personally love using grid lines. It helps me figure proportions, but also improve at my sketching and my drawing. So I think that's a really good, useful thing. Also, over on Patreon, you can get the full 2-hour-long version of this. This right here is the cut-up version. It has all of the really important pieces, but if you want the whole thing, all of the extra little details, you can find that over on Patreon with over 30 other hour-long lessons like these. Oh, camera down. And if you do that, you also really help support myself, the channel. You make sure that this thing gets to keep the lights on and keep growing. So thank you to everyone who does support the channel over on Patreon. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section down below. If you finish the piece and you'd like to share it with me, send it to me on the Patreon community tab, and I will see you in a video very shortly. Thank you so much for watching, and let's jump into today's hour-long cut-up lesson version thing. Before we begin here today, I would like to quickly note that the canvas that you are currently looking at did not come black. I got a regular 8x10 canvas board, painted it black with Mars black, let it fully dry, and then drew my sketch on with a white colored pencil. That way I could actually see what I was doing. Then, from there, I'm going to go to my palette here. It is a glass palette with a gray sheet underneath. That way I can see both dark and light values. And I'm taking a square-headed brush. It's about a medium-sized square-headed brush. I'm taking a lot of titanium white, a little bit of primary red, a little bit of primary yellow, and a little bit of burnt umber. I'm mixing all of those together on the palette. Then I'm going to begin applying this new very light pigment to the sky in our painting, predominantly to the brightest area of the sky in our painting. I'm also re-going over areas and ensuring that everything has a nice smooth application. Speaking of smooth applications though, I'm using a very soft touch of my brush here, that way I don't smear paint on either edge of the brush as I drag it, and I'm using a fair amount of water as well. This is going to extend the wet life of my paint and ensure that I can kind of blend the top area down into the bottom area without having these kind of awkward streaks or strokes in between these breaks in pigment. So what that's going to do is going to extend the wet life. It's going to allow you to drag it out farther. It's also going to make the paint slightly more transparent, which can be an issue, but we had to do a good number of layers anyway, so in this case I think it's just fine. Now over here you can see that I'm mixing up a new pigment. It is going to be very bright, but it's going to look slightly dark relative to our last pigment. Now I'm using the medium-sized square round-headed brush here, and essentially what this is an easy way to apply pigment and have it be feathered and soft on all edges. I like to use the square-headed brushes when I want to incorporate a sharp edge. I use a round-headed brush when I want to incorporate a softer edge. It's also worth noting that I just took my brush and I blended back all of that pigment with some water so that it progressively got darker and darker. And that's essentially what we want to do to form all of these clouds. We start with a very bright edge, and then we have a mid-tone, and then we try to blend it black until we get to the black areas. I'm also going back in and adding some additional highlights to that pigment that we just added. That way we have something that's a little bit closer between the highlight that we have for the real emitting light and the light that's hitting the clouds. Again, the more stages that you can create in these transitions, the better, the more realistic and interesting your painting will look. Now here I'm taking that same round-headed brush, I'm taking a titanium white with really our initial mixture, and I'm going back, I'm applying that to the top of the light, and then I'm blending it downwards in these circular strokes. Now as you can see, it looks incredibly different from our first application, despite the fact that it's very much an incredibly similar color. And that's just because now we're layering a light pigment over a light pigment instead of layering a light pigment over a dark pigment. Now, I'm also switching to the smaller round-headed brush, and I'm going back in and adding some detail and highlights to the clouds with these same pigments. And I'm doing this really for the same reasons. When we applied those first layers of clouds, they were semi-transparent. We could see the darker layer underneath, but now we're building highlight on top of highlight, and we get something that's much more interesting. So that's really what I'm doing here. And I'm starting with the edges of the clouds that are closest to the light, the areas that should be the brightest, and then I'm working my way inwards, downwards, upwards, etc., and allowing that paint to naturally dissipate on my brush. And that should render a fairly natural look on the actual painting. So here I'm going back up to that light source and, surprise, surprise, doing yet another layer of highlight because it needs it. When I added that second highlighted layer, for the most part, what we saw under it was our first layer of highlight, but we did still see that black showing through to a minor amount. And this is a perfect example of the fact that we did, because as you can see that I'm now adding this third application of highlight, it's getting brighter and brighter. Now I'm moving down into the ground. I'm using the medium-sized square-headed brush, and here I have a highlight that's fairly similar to that what we used in the light on the top of the painting. This is going to be that light shining down and hitting the top of this little mountain in the background. Then I'm going to grab some burnt umber and incorporate that on the bottom, as you can see here. I'm using that square-headed brush because I did want a sharp edge for this little mountain here, and because I wanted to be able to transport a good amount of paint. Now here I tried something, and I do mean tried something. It did not work. It did not work at all. You are more than welcome to skip this step of the little painting here, but I wanted to incorporate it in this lesson because I wanted to show you that we can all try things, we can all make mistakes, and we can all cover them up and fix them, because I do end up fixing it. But here essentially my thought process was I'll have a very dark water to match the reflection of the edges, and then I'll have this light that's shining through the middle of it from the light that's in the sky. However, it's a little incorrect because the light isn't coming straight down in this painting, right? We talked about how the fact that it's kind of moving to the right, and we have this large cloud on the left-hand side that's blocking it. So really the light's moving to the right. It's not coming straight down. The reflection isn't going to work in that way. So what do I need to do? I need to cover that entirely back up, and then I need to add the light over to the far right-hand side where the light is actually going to be shining down on it. Now I'm going to grab some Mars black paint. For the first time in this painting, we covered the backboard with the black, but we haven't actually touched it since that dried. So I'm adding some of that to the painting, and I'm going to begin darkening this yet again because I did make it a little bit bright, and we can definitely bring this back down. Now we do have a lot of titanium white on the canvas currently. I'm adding a lot of Mars black to it. What do the two mix to make? A gray. And a gray actually really isn't a bad thing in this scenario, especially a dark gray, because while the eye goes to the brightest point in any piece, it also tends to look for saturation. And if the more saturated areas of this piece are up in the sky, then the eye is going to look up there. So if we can make everything else in the painting just slightly more desaturated, then we're really going to help aid the piece in directing the eye. So moving on from there, I'm switching over to an older square-headed brush. This is one where the bristles leaf off in varying directions, so when you make a tapping motion with it, you get a good amount of implication on your canvas. And as you can see here, I'm using a green. It is simply a mixture of the Mars black and the primary yellow. When you mix the two together, you do also get a green. You can make a much more lush green by using a primary blue and a primary yellow, but you can get this nice warm olive green with the Mars black and primary yellow. So I'm essentially applying this with this tapping motion to the edges of the trees that I feel are going to be receiving the most light. So now I'm going back and I'm adding a second layer of highlight. Most of our subjects will be done through multiple layers of highlights and darker areas, The sky was definitely not the only area that you can do this in, especially when you're working on a darker canvas. And now, as you can see, we are starting to build up multiple values. So we're going back yet again to that light value, mid-tone, dark tone. Now I'm switching over to the smaller square-headed brush. I'm grabbing a mixture of titanium white and burnt umber, and I'm just kind of creating the base and the trunk for our trees here. I'm doing it with a mixture of a tapping and a stroke motion. When you're working on bark in the foreground, sometimes it's done with a tapping motion. You can see a lot of detail in it. Maybe you can see knots and even different pieces of bark protruding, creating shadows on others. However, here these trees are still fairly far away, and we're not going to see that detail. So when you're creating the edges of these trees, you can kind of create like a soft guiding line for them, because that far away we're just not going to recognize the texture in them. Now here I'm taking that same small square-headed brush. I'm creating two edges essentially for the light that is going to be shining down. Then I'm creating some additional light in the middle. I'm starting back in the actual light, and then I'm blending it downwards. I'm allowing the edges to be brighter, and I'm just ensuring that it's very transparent. So I am still using a lot of water in this mixture as well. So it's important to recognize kind of how to balance all of this. I also want the edges to be fairly transparent, but not as transparent as that middle area. Here you can see that I'm continuously going back and blending these even farther, and it's really doing a great job of creating something subtle and kind of ethereal as well. Now I'm going to go back to my water, ensure that my brush is fairly damp, grab some additional highlight, and create another kind of ray of light here. I'm working it in between portions of these protruding clouds, and that way we get something that yet again creates a lot of depth, because we have something moving from the farthest area of the painting into a foreground / middle ground, but working its way around other subjects, so it looks much more interesting and intricate. Now that I've added some light coming down from the sky here, I'm going to add a little bit of an additional highlight to that mountain there, where I feel like it's going to be receiving the most highlight, and then I'm going to finally incorporate the proper highlights down into the water, as you can see here. I'm starting from the far right hand side, and then I'm dragging my brush to the left, allowing the paint to dissipate. That way I get this little trail of pigment that's initially larger, and then it gets smaller and smaller and more transparent as I run out of paint, as it blends with the other layer, as it becomes transparent over the other layer. We went back in and we added light to the mountain, we went back in and we added light to the water, and now I'm going back in and adding a little bit of light to this tree as well, just to ensure that it looks very natural. Not all of the trees are going to be receiving the same amount of highlight, because not all of the trees are in the same area, and some of them are going to have more shadow on them, and that's also going to make the painting look ever so interesting. Now I'm grabbing that same smaller square-headed brush. I'm grabbing some burnt umber, some Mars black, creating a fairly dark mixture. And as you can see, I drew back in my tree because I had lost it in the initial painting process. So this is a time where you could do that as well. Make sure that the paint on the canvas is entirely dry before you go back over it with a white colored pencil. And then I'm just going to go over this white colored pencil drawing yet again with my pigment. Now this pigment is very dark. It's going to stand out from the dark areas of the sky, as you can see. It's still not a pure black. I did have a bit of burnt umber in it. There is a good amount of water on my brush so that I can make these very small, sharp applications. I'm using almost no pressure at all on the canvas itself. And now I'm going to work on the highlighted edge for this tree as well. And I'm going to do this with a mixture of tapping motions and dragging motions. Sometimes I'll use a tapping motion because it ensures that I'm not accidentally adding additional pressure. Sometimes when you drag your brush, depending upon the angle of your arm, the way you're sitting, the way you're standing, the way your canvas is positioned, you can accidentally lean into it a little bit and expand the bristles and get a larger application. But if you're continuously just tapping every application, you are incredibly mindful and cognizant of. Now here I'm simply going back in and I'm drawing in some additional little highlights. So I'm just going back and forth with it in the same way that I did the highlights as well. Here's a good example of a lot of those very small tapping motions mixed with a little bit of a drag as well. So it really isn't a one or the other scenario. It's whatever you feel is best for the subject. Sometimes a combination also works really well. I've shown you in this lesson how we use the old square-headed brush for the tapping motion, so you get all the different implications, but you can also use that with a dragging motion and create a lot of little strokes as well, almost in the same effect as a rake brush. Now this tree is going to be different from the other trees that we had, just because I wanted to instill a little bit of additional diversity here. As you can see, I'm taking some primary red and some titanium white, and this is going to be for our petals. Now I'm using the smaller round-headed brush here because I want a good amount of detail, and I'm okay if it's a little bit feathered or softer. These are petals, and while they could have a very sharp aesthetic, they could also have something that's a little bit more delicate. So here I'm trying to create little flowers. They maybe have 3 or 4 varying petals on them. They all connect at the bottom and then they all move outwards in varying directions. And I'm going to create these for the most parts at the ends of my stems initially, and then I'm going to work downwards and inwards as well. I'm not going to add too many of these to this area. I just want it to be subtle. I want it to be just enough. I want to still see through portions of this tree, as we do have interesting things going on behind the tree, and we don't want to overcomplicate the area. Now I'm going back in some finishing touches at this point. I'm adding in some highlights around the light where the light rays are going to be shining. I'm applying that, I'm moving it down the light ray, and then I'm allowing it to dissipate fairly quickly. That way it looks like there really is a lot of light coming from this area. It's moving through the clouds, and then it's casting down upon the trees, upon the mountains, and upon just about everything else. Hey there, it's Ryan O'Rourke. I truly hope you enjoyed today's little extra video. It was essentially a cut-up version of one of the many hour-long lessons which we offer over on patreon.com. Over there you'll also find digital sketches of the 10-minute painting lessons, digital sketches of these hour-long painting lessons, and a bunch of reference photos as well. So if any of that interests you, or if you just want to support the channel, go over there and check it out. It is a pleasure to make these long form videos, and I love to share them with all of you. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you next Saturday with a new video, and above all, as always, stay creative.